Something strange is happening with the rumored Spiral Abyss for version 6.4, and at first glance it looks like a very obvious character setup. The first half of the Abyss gives the active character a massive 75% Anemo damage bonus. The second half gives characters a 75% boost to Cryo Normal Attack damage. Those are huge buffs, the kind that normally exist for a very specific reason. But when players started looking deeper at the enemy lineup and the mechanics, the situation started to look a lot more complicated. Because on paper, this Abyss almost feels like it's trying to point us towards certain characters. Anemo damage for the first half immediately makes people think about Anemo carries, and Cryo Normal Attack damage in the second half sounds very specific as well. Normally, when Spiral Abyss buffs are this direct, it means the developers are trying to highlight particular playstyles or newly released characters. But the moment people started digging into the rest of the rumored mechanics, things got weird. Alongside the damage buffs, there's also a special reaction mechanic called Windlash. Whenever a character triggers a swirl reaction on an enemy, they gain a stack of Windlash. You can build up to 4 stacks, and when you hit the maximum, it unleashes a shockwave that deals true damage directly at the enemy's position. That shockwave can trigger roughly every 6 seconds if you're building stacks quickly. Now think about what that means for a second. Swirl reactions can trigger extremely fast in teams that constantly apply elements. So if your team is constantly swirling Pyro, Cryo, Hydro, or Electro, you're basically generating extra bursts of true damage on top of your normal rotation. And that's where the first interesting question appears. Is this actually meant to support Anemo DPS, or is it secretly buffing Anemo supports? Because characters that trigger the most swirl reactions aren't always the Anemo damage dealers. In fact, some of the fastest swirl generation in the game comes from characters like Venti or Kazuha, constantly interacting with off-field elements. So while the buff says Anemo damage, the mechanic itself might actually reward teams that spam reactions instead. And if that's the case, the intended meta might not be what people expect. Now let's talk about the second half of the Abyss, because this is where things start getting even more specific. The buff there increases Cryo Normal Attack damage by 75%, which immediately suggests characters who rely on normal attack chains rather than bursts or skill damage. Freeze teams instantly come to mind. And interestingly, one of the rumored boss encounters in this half is Hilgeta, an enemy that actually encourages freeze strategies. According to the strategy notes circulating with the rumor, Hilgeta can summon a device that grants her armor after a sequence of attacks. If she successfully activates that armor, the fight becomes significantly harder. But here's the twist. If you stagger her or immobilize her at the right moment, you can prevent the armor from activating entirely. Which means teams that can lock enemies down, like freeze teams, suddenly become extremely valuable. So now the Cryo Normal Attack buff starts to make more sense. If players can constantly freeze Hilgeta while dealing boosted normal attack damage, they can effectively shut down the mechanic before it ever becomes a problem. And that leads directly to another interesting observation about the rumored enemy lineup. Because the Abyss isn't just filled with standard enemies. Some of the bosses listed include the Perpetual Mechanical Array, the Radiant Moonfly, the Radiant Glacial Wolf, and even the Secret Source Automaton Overseer device. These aren't pushovers. Several of them have mechanics that can disrupt rotations, force repositioning, or punish teams that rely on slow setups. The Radiant Moonfly in particular introduces one of the most unusual mechanics here. It can trap the player inside something called a Radiant Cocoon that deals heavy damage over time. The counterplay is surprisingly simple. You either heal yourself back to full HP to escape the cocoon, or you stay outside its range before it activates. That small detail actually changes how players approach the fight. Instead of only focusing on damage output, teams might need strong healing or mobility to avoid getting trapped at the wrong moment. And when you combine all of these mechanics together, the picture becomes much more interesting. Because the Abyss buffs might be suggesting certain characters, but the enemy design might push players toward completely different solutions. And that's exactly what the community discussion is starting to reflect. Some players initially looked at the 75% Anemo damage buff and immediately assumed it was designed for Varka. After all, Varka is one of the most talked about Anemo characters right now, and Spiral Abyss buffs often line up with current banners or recent releases. But when people started actually testing similar setups in current content, the results were unexpected. Instead of Varka dominating clears, players were seeing teams built around characters like Mavuika clearing bosses faster in certain situations, especially when strong grouping abilities were involved. The logic is pretty simple. If the mechanic rewards frequent swirl reactions and fast area damage, then teams with extremely high front-loaded damage can sometimes take advantage of the mechanic better than the character it was supposedly designed for. And that's why some players are starting to joke that this Abyss might accidentally buff completely different teams. For example, imagine combining strong grouping from an Anemo support with a high-damage elemental DPS constantly triggering swirls. Every swirl contributes toward the Windlash stacks, which means the shockwave damage keeps firing during your rotation. In other words, the mechanic doesn't strictly care about who is dealing the damage. It only cares about how often swirl is happening. And that opens the door for some very unconventional clears. Meanwhile, the second half could end up becoming a playground for freeze-focused teams. Characters that constantly apply cryo and rely on normal attack chains could benefit enormously from that 75% damage boost, especially if those teams can lock down bosses like Hiljetta before their defensive mechanics activate. So instead of a simple, "this Abyss is for one character" situation, what we might actually be seeing is a meta puzzle. One side rewards swirl generation and fast reaction loops. The other rewards freeze control and boosted normal attack damage. And depending on how players build their teams, the characters that end up dominating might not be the ones the buffs initially suggest. Of course, it's important to remember that all of this information is still based on rumors. The enemy lineup, the buffs, and even the mechanics could change before the final version appears in-game. But even as a rumor, this Abyss design is already creating a fascinating discussion. Because if these mechanics stay the same, version 6.4 might produce some of the most unusual Spiral Abyss clears we've seen in a long time. Teams that trigger swirl faster than expected. Freeze teams locking down bosses before mechanics activate. And maybe even players discovering strategies that completely ignore the intended characters. So now I'm curious what you think. If this rumored Abyss actually goes live like this, which teams do you think will dominate the first half? Will it really favor Anemo carries, or will swirl-heavy reaction teams steal the spotlight instead? And for the second half, are we about to see freeze teams become the easiest solution against Hiljetta? Let me know your predictions in the comments. And if you enjoyed breaking down these Abyss rumors together, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more Genshin Impact discussions, rumors, and meta-analysis.